Welcome to our presentation on the types of chords that we have in contemporary pop and rock music. And in this video we're going to focus on, firstly, what is a chord? So a chord is a combination of three or more notes. Where they're played together. We typically think of a chord as a triad, that means three notes. You can have what are called dyads, or a two-note kind of a chord. And you might later get into looking at what are tetrachords, but the main thing is to remember triads. What are the main types of chords in pop and rock? Well, we of course have our major chords, our happy sounding chords, and our minor chords, which have that more somber, sad sounding. We have the augmented chord, which gives us a little bit of something a little bit extra, tangy, and a diminished chord, which where we've taken something away to give it a little bit more of a spooky sound as well. Later on we'll be looking at seventh chords, not in this course, where we can add a little bit on the end, either a seventh or even a ninth. And in beyond the purvey of this course, but you might already be playing things like altered chords, where we add extra notes but the notes actually come from outside the scale. But let's focus now on the major type of chords. So a major chord is the 1, 3, 5 of the scale. There's a scale of C. The 1 is the root. The 3 is the third note of the scale, and the 5. In this case, in the case of C, it's C, E, G. Making a chord, in this case, the root position, where the lowest note is the root note, in this case C. A little link there to the wiki, on which is where I got these images from. So moving on from the major chord, if we take the third note of the scale, which in this case is E, and flatten it, we make a minor chord. So notice how we've used the little flat symbol in front of the E to get that, create that minor chord feel. Obviously a much more sad sounding chord. Okay, moving on from the minor chord, we have what we call the augmented chord. This is where when we leave the 1 and the 3, but we then augment or raise the fifth note. So that's the note that gets changed. And so there's our G note, sharpened, and gives us that sort of extra tang in the augmented chord. Now on the guitar, an augmented chord is often played in, say, for example, a blues. Here's the 5th fret version, and it's a good chord to use when you come to a turnaround in the blues. Okay. Now a diminished chord, which is where we've taken first of all, we've flattened the third note of the scale, but we've also then flattened the fifth note of the scale. A bit trickier to do just on a C chord, but I'll give you an example of a diminished sounding chord here. And that gives us a slightly, spookier sound. So we've flattened not only the third note, but the fifth note of the chord, and so we have that diminished sound. So now we're going to look at what we call inversions. And we're going to just think of it mainly as far as writing songs, and recognizing some of the symbols that you might see in music. Now, inversion just means swapping the order of the notes that make up the chord. So in the root position in the chart on the right hand side, we have the C, E, G. That's C in root position. If we instead use the third note of the scale as the root, as the lowest note, no longer the root, the root is still C, but the lowest note in the chord is the E. That is known as the first inversion. And on the guitar, I'm just holding that E note at the second fret, open G, C. And then we have the second inversion where we start with the fifth note of the scale, in this case G. And that just gives us more choices that we can use for our sounds. Now sometimes where we want to display what the lowest note of the chord will be, we can use what are called slash chords. So in the bottom diagram we see the C in the root position, but in the second one the G note has become the lowest note, and so it's become a and then but in order to display that, we use the slash G to indicate the lowest note. And then finally, in the second inversion, the slash E represents that we're going to use an E as the lowest note. Now, in guitar, a couple of examples of using different lower notes. We have, say, for example, on the C chord, if we make, instead of where naturally the E is going to be the lowest note, if we replace that, put our third finger on the G note, we get a much fuller sounding C chord. Now that would be a slash chord with the G at the base. So guitarists, we naturally use inversions when we play our chords up the neck in those different caged positions. In this case, I'm playing a C at the 5th fret with barred at the 3rd, or alternatively in an E shape up at the 8th fret. So the link that I've given you on this PowerPoint will take you to a site that explains another site where you can learn from Guitar World about slash chords and how they're used. But in fact they were used by some of the rock and roll greats such as Jimi Hendrix. Now on the next slide we see an example of a slash chord in operation in a very typical sound. So in the first chord, C is there, followed by a G chord, but it's the bass, the root, the lowest note is not the G, it's the B. So it's a very common progression. And in the second example there we have G. Then we have a D with the F sharp in the bass and an E, which gives us a nice transition and a moving bass line along with the chord, rather than if we had the G chord with a D. Notice how the bass line there jumps a lot more. Oh, that was meant to be. So notice when we use these slash chords and we use different lowest notes on the chord, we can create some pretty cool little progressions. And it'd be great if you could think about that when you are doing your songwriting. So in our final example, higher up the neck, our good friend Jimi Hendrix used this type of sound quite a lot on electric guitar rather than acoustic. Played that accurately, but just to give you a feel of it. So that's that sound that Jimi Hendrix used by using slash chords, different roots for his chords. Okay, thank you very much and I hope you enjoy playing around with the different types of chords when you're doing your songwriting.